At exactly 68 years old, Eleanor Vance packed a single cardboard box while her husband of 4 decades poured champagne for her best friend in the kitchen. But what Arthur and Diane didn't know was that paper empires burn easily. Their arrogance made them completely blind to the forged foundations beneath them. If you have ever poured your life into building someone else's dream, this story is for you. If you have been erased by the people you trusted most, stay here. If you have been handed the scraps of your own life and told to be grateful, keep listening. Subscribe now, because of what Eleanor found inside a rotting wooden box. It will make you believe that justice never gets the address wrong. The rain hit the windshield of her 10-year-old sedan in heavy sheets. Eleanor kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Her knuckles were white against the worn leather. On the passenger seat next to her sat Barnaby. He was a 12-year-old golden retriever with a grey muzzle and a severe limp. He rested his heavy head over the edge of a wooden drafting box. Next to the box sat a heavy brass compass. Her grandfather had given her that compass when she was 12. It had sat on the corner of her mahogany desk for 40 years. She had polished the brass every Sunday evening. Now it rattled against the cheap plastic console of her car. She drove past the heavy iron gates of the estate she had designed. The tires crushed the imported gravel she had personally selected. She remembered the early years. She had given up her interior design residency in Paris to help Arthur start his firm. She answered the single rotary phone on a folding card table for 3 years. She managed the billing and client relations for 4 decades without ever drawing a paycheck. When Arthur's parents became bedridden, she moved them into the guest room. She washed their linens and managed their medication for 6 years. She did this so Arthur could travel to secure commercial contracts. She cooked every client dinner that landed those contracts. She served the meals, poured the wine, and quietly washed the dishes. She listened to them celebrate in the formal dining room. She never asked for her own name on the company letterhead. She thought marriage was the only contract that mattered. The brass compass slid as she took a sharp turn onto the highway. She reached out and steadied the cold metal with one finger. She thought about the scene in the lawyer's office 3 hours earlier. The mahogany conference table had been polished to a high gloss. Arthur sat on one side in a custom Italian suit. Diane sat next to him. Diane had been Eleanor's maid of honor 40 years ago. Today, Diane wore Eleanor's favorite pearl necklace. The attorney slid the divorce papers across the table. He did not look Eleanor in the eye. Arthur leaned forward and tapped the thick stack of documents. He told her the prenuptial agreement was ironclad. He said he was keeping the firm, the estate, and the investment portfolios. Diane checked her phone and smiled at a text message. She did this while the attorney read the final numbers. Diane tapped her manicured nails on the mahogany table. She reached over and adjusted Arthur's silk tie. She brushed a piece of lint from his shoulder. She did this while Eleanor sat across from them with absolutely nothing. Arthur slid a single key across the table. He told her he was not leaving her completely destitute. He said she could have the decommissioned fire lookout tower on the northern ridge. He had bought the land 20 years ago for a hunting cabin and abandoned the idea. He said he was just being realistic about their separate futures. He told her not to make this harder than it needed to be. Eleanor had looked at the key. It was rusted at the edges. She looked at her husband of 40 years. She looked at the woman who had held her hand when her mother died. She picked up the key. She didn't say a word. Now she drove north on the interstate. The rain turned to sleet as the elevation climbed. The heater in the old sedan barely worked. Barnaby shivered on the passenger seat. Eleanor reached over and draped her heavy wool coat over his back. She watched the needle on the gas gauge drop toward empty. The brass compass pointed steadily north. She had no idea what a fire tower looked like on the inside. She knew it would be cold. She knew it would be empty. The windshield wipers squeaked against the glass. The sound was a scraping metronome in the quiet car. Eleanor's lower back ached from the unyielding car seat. Her hands throbbed with the familiar dull pain of early arthritis. She had ignored the pain for years while typing Arthur's endless daily emails. She gripped the steering wheel tighter. She watched the city lights fade in the rearview mirror. The towering glass buildings she had helped finance disappeared into the grey fog. They belonged to Arthur now. She glanced at the wooden drafting box under Barnaby's chin. Arthur had demanded she take it. He said he didn't want her old junk cluttering up the new home office. He said Diane needed the space for her yoga equipment. Eleanor had packed the box without looking inside. She had carried it out to the car in the pouring rain. Arthur hadn't offered an umbrella. He had simply closed the heavy oak door behind her. The brass compass caught a flash of headlights from a passing truck. The metal gleamed for a split second in the dark cabin. Eleanor took a deep breath of the freezing air coming through the vents. She did not cry. Eleanor Vance was exactly 68 years old. She kept a photograph of Paris hidden in the back of her closet. It was a faded picture of a design studio with tall windows. She had been 24 when the acceptance letter arrived. Arthur had looked at the letter and rubbed his temples. He had told her he could not afford the rent on the commercial space alone. He said his new architectural firm would fail before it even started. Eleanor walked to the kitchen trash can and dropped the letter inside. She never spoke of the tall windows again. She spent the next 40 years looking at spreadsheet columns. She unpacked her bags and set up a folding card table in a rented garage. She answered a rotary phone for 3 years. She learned the tax codes for commercial real estate development. She tracked every expense, every invoice, and every delayed payment. She negotiated with angry contractors when Arthur overspent the budget. She did this sitting in a windowless office down the hall from his corner suite. She managed the billing department for 4 decades without ever drawing a paycheck. Her only personal item was the heavy brass compass her grandfather had given her. It sat on a small square of green felt next to her adding machine. She liked the weight of it in her hand. She liked that it always found its direction, no matter how much she spun it. Arthur's parents arrived on a Tuesday in a medical transport van. The firm was just beginning to turn a significant profit. Arthur told her a care facility would drain their liquidity. He said his mother needed family, not strangers. Eleanor converted the bright sunroom into a sterile medical ward. She learned how to turn a grown adult to prevent bed sores. She learned how to clean feeding tubes and empty catheter bags. She slept on a small cot between their 2 beds. She listened to the hiss of the oxygen concentrator all night. She did this for 2,190 days. When Arthur returned from his business trips, she made sure the house smelled of roasted chicken. She hid the soiled sheets in the basement laundry room. She mashed their food and spoon-fed them while Arthur flew to Dubai to meet investors. She held his mother's hand when she took her last breath. Arthur had been in a first-class lounge in London. She never asked for her name on the company letterhead. She never asked for equity or a formal title. She believed marriage was a partnership built on silent labor. She trusted him completely because of a specific memory from 1987. They had just signed the lease on their first real office building. Arthur had lifted her off the ground and spun her around the empty lobby. He had looked into her eyes and called her his foundation. He had said he could never have built any of it without her. Eleanor had held that memory tightly for decades. She used it as a shield against his growing coldness. When Arthur needed to impress the City Planning Commission, he hosted a gala at their estate. He hired a catering company, but refused to pay for a professional event planner. Eleanor spent 4 months organizing the seating charts. She handwrote 200 place cards in perfect calligraphy. She sourced the floral arrangements from local farms to save money. She spent 6 weeks at a sewing machine in the basement. She altered a pattern and stitched a midnight blue evening gown. She wore the dress on the night of the gala. She stood near the kitchen doors to ensure the service ran smoothly. Arthur stood in the center of the ballroom. He clinked his glass and gave a speech about self-made success. He did not mention Eleanor. Diane stood next to him in a designer dress purchased with alimony money. Diane had been Eleanor's best friend since college. Diane had a habit of dropping by just as Arthur's car pulled into the driveway. Diane wore expensive perfume that lingered in the hallway. Eleanor never noticed how closely Diane watched Arthur. She never noticed how Arthur lingered when he poured Diane's wine. She was too busy managing the 1,000 small details that kept his life frictionless. Her daily life was a synchronized routine of service. She woke every morning at 5:30. She brewed Arthur's specific dark roast coffee. She ironed his shirts and polished his leather Oxfords. She set his coffee cup exactly 2 inches from the edge of the placemat. She checked his itinerary and packed his leather briefcase. She walked Barnaby down the imported gravel driveway to fetch the paper. She spent her afternoons managing the estate's massive garden. She planted every hydrangea bush by hand. She pruned the climbing roses that wrapped around the iron gates. She did not know that a frictionless life creates a terrifying sense of entitlement. She did not know that her 40 years of invisible labor had made her disposable. The heavy brass compass sat on her mahogany desk at home. The glass face was scratched from decades of moving from desk to desk. It was the only thing she owned that did not have Arthur's name attached to it. The rain was pouring when Eleanor parked her 10-year-old sedan. The windshield wipers were broken on the passenger side. She walked toward the towering glass building she had helped finance. The wind whipped her silver hair around her face. Her heavy navy wool coat was completely soaked at the shoulders. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors into the dry heat of the lobby. Her weathered leather boots squeaked against the polished marble floor. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 31st floor. The brass compass was heavy in her right coat pocket. She kept her hand wrapped around the cold metal. The elevator hummed as it climbed higher above the city streets. Eleanor watched the digital numbers change on the display panel. She took one deep breath before the doors slid open. Eleanor walked through the glass double doors of the law firm. The receptionist was a young woman Eleanor had personally hired 5 years ago. The receptionist quickly looked down at her computer keyboard. She suddenly became very interested in a stack of blank envelopes. She did not offer her usual warm greeting. Eleanor walked past the front desk and down the long carpeted hallway. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main conference room. The afternoon sun cut through the tall window blinds. Dust motes danced in the harsh bands of light. The mahogany table was polished to a high mirror gloss. Eleanor sat in a leather chair at the far end of the table. Across the wide expanse of wood sat Arthur. He wore a custom charcoal suit, paid for by the firm's latest expansion. Diane sat next to him. Diane sat so close to Arthur that their shoulders pressed firmly together. Diane wore a cream cashmere sweater and Eleanor's favorite pearl necklace. The attorney walked in and dropped a thick stack of papers on the table. The document was exactly 90 pages long. Arthur leaned forward and placed his gold fountain pen on top of the stack. He folded his hands over his leather portfolio. "We are just being realistic, Eleanor," Arthur said softly. "You have to see that this is what is best for everyone." Eleanor looked at the gold pen. She had bought him that pen for their 20th wedding anniversary. "The prenuptial agreement is perfectly clear," the attorney said to the room. Diane picked up her phone and opened a luxury furniture catalogue. She began scrolling through pictures of expensive living room sets. She paused to zoom in on a green velvet sofa. She did this while the attorney read the list of marital assets. This was her best friend of 40 years. Diane did not even look up when the summer house was mentioned. She simply tapped the screen to save the image. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Arthur added. "You should have been more financially responsible, Eleanor." Arthur adjusted his silk tie and leaned back in his leather chair. "This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead." He said this to the woman who had managed his billing for 4 decades. He said this to the woman who built his empire from a folding table. The attorney cleared his throat and read the final division of assets. The architectural firm to Arthur, the country estate to Arthur, the investment portfolios to Arthur. While Diane smiled and saved photos of velvet sofas, Eleanor received what they called a generous settlement, a rusted key, and a deed to a rotting fire tower on a remote mountain. Arthur slid the rusted key across the polished mahogany table. It stopped just inches from Eleanor's folded hands. "It's a clean break," Arthur said. "You always said you wanted peace and quiet." He pointed to a heavy wooden drafting box sitting on the carpet by the door. "I put your old desk things in there. Take it with you today. Diane needs the home office cleared out by this evening for her yoga studio." Eleanor looked at Diane. Diane finally locked her phone screen and looked up. Diane touched the pearls at her neck and gave a small, tight smile. "We're worried about you, Elle," Diane said softly. "At your age, you can't manage that big house alone anyway. You will be so much more comfortable up there." Eleanor looked back at her husband. She looked at the man she had fed, clothed, and built for 40 years. She pulled her hand from her coat pocket. She picked up the rusted key from the polished wood. She picked up the gold pen. She signed her name on the final page of the document without reading it. She placed the pen perfectly parallel to the edge of the paper. "I hope you both find exactly what you are looking for," Eleanor said. She stood up and walked to the heavy oak door. She picked up the heavy wooden box by its thick leather handle. She walked out of the conference room and down the quiet hallway. She didn't look back. Eleanor sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in a roadside motel. The neon vacancy sign buzzed through the thin curtains. It cast a flickering red glow across the stained floral bedspread. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. Rain lashed against the single pane of glass. She wore her damp navy wool coat over her shoulders. The heater in the corner rattled but produced only cold air. Barnaby lay on the thin brown carpet near the bathroom door. His grey muzzle rested heavily on his front paws. He watched her with wide, unblinking eyes. Every time a truck rolled past on the highway, he twitched. Eleanor reached into her canvas tote bag. She pulled out a white paper bank envelope and a small leather coin purse. She dumped the contents onto the floral bedspread. She smoothed out the crumpled bills with the side of her thumb. She stacked the quarters, dimes, and pennies into neat, even towers. She counted the money 3 times. She had exactly $412.18 left in the world. This was the entire sum of 40 years of labor. She pushed the coins back into the leather purse. She left the bills sitting on the blanket. She reached into her deep coat pocket. She pulled out her black prepaid smartphone. She placed it flat on the chipped laminate nightstand. She pressed the button on the side. The screen flared with a harsh blue light in the dark room. The missed calls counter read 0. The text message notification icon read 0. She opened her email inbox. The only new message was a digital coupon from a pharmacy. It was a reminder to refill her arthritis medication. She swiped the notification away. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. She sat in the quiet room and listened to the rain. The silence from her family was absolute. She did not have a sister or a brother to call. Diane had been her emergency contact for 30 years. Arthur had been her entire world. Now, she was completely erased from their daily orbit. She reached into the other pocket of her coat. Her fingers found the cold metal of the heavy brass compass. She pulled it out and set it next to the stack of bills. The glass face reflected the red neon light from the window. The needle vibrated slightly before settling on north. She looked at the small pile of money. $412.18. It was not enough for first month, last month, and a security deposit. It was not enough to rent a room in any safe city neighborhood. It was not enough to hire a lawyer to fight a forged document. She looked at the brass compass. She looked at the rusted iron key sitting beside it. The fire lookout tower was located on a ridge 300 miles away. Arthur had called it a rotting wooden box in the sky. He had laughed when he handed her the deed. She picked up the brass compass. The metal was warming against her palm. She rubbed her thumb over the scratched glass face. She thought about walking into a city social services office. She thought about sitting in a plastic chair and explaining her life to a stranger. She thought about asking for a voucher for a women's shelter. She looked down at Barnaby. The old golden retriever thumped his tail once against the carpet. He pushed his wet nose against her knee. City shelters did not take 12-year-old dogs with bad hips. Eleanor put the compass back into her coat pocket. She gathered the paper bills and folded them into her purse. She pulled a folded paper map from her canvas bag. She spread it out across the floral bedspread. She traced a blue highway line with her index finger. The line led deep into a green shaded area marked as state forest. The contour lines on the map grew tight and clustered near the end of the road. She folded the map carefully along its original creases. She stood up from the sagging mattress. Her knees popped loudly in the cold room. She walked to the small bathroom and filled a plastic cup with tap water. She set it on the floor for Barnaby. He lapped the water slowly, spilling drops onto the linoleum. She went to the wooden drafting box sitting by the door. She lifted it by the thick leather handle. She carried it out to the car in the pouring rain. She opened the passenger door for Barnaby. She lifted his back legs to help him into the seat. She walked around the front of the sedan and got behind the wheel. She put the key in the ignition and turned it. The old engine sputtered, coughed, and finally caught. She turned the headlights on. The beams cut through the heavy sheets of falling rain. She pulled out of the motel parking lot. She did not turn back toward the city. She steered the car toward the highway on-ramp. She followed the needle of the brass compass pointing north toward the mountain. Eleanor drove for 6 hours into the thinning air of the Blackwood Mountains. The 10-year-old sedan struggled against the steep incline of the winding pass. The rain finally stopped, leaving a heavy gray fog clinging to the pine trees. She pulled into a small dirt lot gas station at the base of the final ridge. The town consisted of a general store with a faded canvas awning. Across the street sat a small diner with red checkered curtains in the windows. The gas station had only 2 rusted pumps with analog dials. Eleanor stepped out of the car to stretch her aching lower back. An older man in a faded denim jacket walked out of the station office. He wiped his grease-stained hands on a red shop rag. He looked at the battered sedan. He looked at Barnaby sleeping in the passenger seat. He looked at Eleanor's face and nodded slowly. "Arthur Vance bought that ridge 20 years ago," the man said. "He did not ask for her name. He came through here exactly once, in a custom-imported truck." The man tossed the red rag onto a metal barrel. "Thomas told us to watch for a woman with a golden retriever. He said you would be coming up this way eventually. We've been waiting for you." Eleanor stood perfectly still by the rusted gas pump. She had never met anyone named Thomas. Arthur had never mentioned anyone in this town. The man filled her tank and refused to take her cash. He pointed to a narrow, washed-out logging road winding up into the fog. Eleanor put the car in gear and began the final climb. The road was rutted with deep mud and scattered with fallen branches. The tires spun twice before catching on the slick rocks. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles throbbed. She drove until the trees broke and the road simply ended. She put the car in park in a rocky clearing. She turned off the engine. The silence of the mountain was absolute and heavy. She stepped out of the car into the biting cold air. Barnaby limped out behind her and sniffed the wet pine needles. Eleanor looked up at the decommissioned fire lookout tower. It was worse than Arthur had described in the lawyer's office. The wooden support beams were grey and splintering from decades of snow. The metal stairs winding up the 70-foot structure were completely coated in rust. The catwalk wrapping around the glass cab was missing several wooden planks. 3 of the large glass windows were completely shattered. A tattered piece of blue tarp flapped violently in the freezing wind. It looked like a massive wooden skeleton left to bleach in the sky. She pulled her heavy navy wool coat tighter around her throat. She looked back at the warm car. She thought about the $400 in her pocket. She reached for the car door handle to get back inside. Then Barnaby let out a soft whine. He was not looking at the car. He was standing at the base of the rusted metal stairs. His grey muzzle was pointed up toward the glass cab. He wagged his tail once. Eleanor looked past the broken glass and the rotting wood. She saw a single unbroken window pane facing directly east. The morning sun broke through the fog and struck that piece of glass. It flared with a brilliant, blinding gold light. It was the exact color of the brass compass in her pocket. She let go of the car door handle. She walked to the trunk and pulled out her canvas tote bag. She grabbed the heavy wooden drafting box by its thick leather handle. She walked to the base of the metal stairs. The rusted iron steps groaned loudly under her weight. She climbed slowly. She kept one hand firmly on the freezing metal railing. Her knees popped with every upward step. Her breath plumed in the cold mountain air. Barnaby followed her, taking each step with painful deliberation. They reached the narrow wooden catwalk at the top. The wind howled through the broken window frames. Eleanor took the rusted iron key from her coat pocket. She slid it into the brass lock of the heavy wooden door. The lock was stiff with ice and decades of disuse. She pressed her shoulder against the wood and turned the key hard. The mechanism clicked loudly in the quiet air. The heavy door swung open inward. The smell of dry rot and abandoned air spilled out onto the catwalk. She stepped across the threshold. The floor of the 14-by-14 glass cab was covered in dead leaves and animal droppings. The wind blew straight through the shattered east windows. Eleanor spent the first 3 days sealing the rotting wooden box in the sky. Her lower back throbbed with a sharp, constant pain from bending over the floorboards. Her knuckles swelled in the freezing air until she could barely close her hands. She ignored the pain in her joints. She established a strict daily routine to keep herself moving. At dawn, she walked down the 70 metal steps to gather fallen deadwood. She hauled water from a small runoff creek in a plastic bucket. She found a roll of heavy agricultural plastic in a rusted metal locker downstairs. She used a rusted staple gun to stretch the thick plastic over the broken window frames. She hammered bent nails straight on a flat rock to repair the loose floorboards. She found an abandoned cast-iron skillet buried under the bottom stairs. She scrubbed the heavy rust away with river sand and cold snow. She cooked cheap dried oats over the open flames of the iron stove. She patched the leaking roof with flattened tin cans she found in the brush. She sealed the edges of the tin with pine pitch she harvested from the trees. She spent hours sanding the splinters from the wooden railing with a rough stone. She did not stop moving until the sun dropped below the tree line. On the 4th afternoon, heavy footsteps echoed on the metal stairs. An older man appeared on the catwalk outside the glass cab. He wore a thick wool sweater and carried an armful of split, dry firewood. He dropped the wood next to the iron stove. He introduced himself as Thomas, a retired county court clerk from the valley. He did not ask why a 68-year-old woman was living in a condemned fire tower. He did not ask about the heavy wooden drafting box sitting in the corner. He simply said he was bringing a delivery up the mountain anyway. There were no other houses on this mountain. Eleanor never knew that. Thomas returned 2 days later with a thermos of hot coffee and a spare blue tarp. He wore thick leatherwork gloves and a faded canvas hat. He helped her stretch the blue tarp over the weakest section of the roof. He worked silently beside her for 3 hours in the freezing wind. He did not offer pity. He did not tell her this was a mistake. He tipped his hat, left the thermos on the drafting box, and walked back down the stairs. On the 7th night, the temperature plummeted below freezing. A severe mountain gale hit the ridge just after midnight. The wind tore the agricultural plastic violently from the east window frame. Snow blew directly onto Eleanor's thin sleeping bag. The fire in the iron stove hissed and died. Eleanor tried to stand, but her right knee buckled under her weight. Her hands were completely numb. Her fingers refused to grip the rusted staple gun. She lay on the freezing floorboards next to the heavy wooden drafting box. Barnaby pressed his warm body against her spine. She pulled her black prepaid phone from her coat pocket. The battery was at 14%. She opened her call log in the dark room. The screen showed 0 missed calls. The message inbox was completely empty. Arthur had not called. Diane had not called. Nobody knew she was freezing on this mountain. She looked at the snow piling on the floorboards. She thought, I cannot fix a shattered window in the dark. I am 68 years old, with $400, and I cannot survive a mountain winter. This is where I stop. This is what dying alone in a wooden box looks like. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind tear at the roof. She lay there for 10 minutes. Then Barnaby sneezed. He stood up on his bad hips and shook the snow from his golden coat. He walked over to the wooden drafting box and nudged the heavy brass compass with his wet nose. The metal clinked sharply against the wood. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at the compass. She looked at the heavy brass tool she had used to navigate her entire life. She pushed herself up off the freezing floor. Her knee popped loudly. She gripped the edge of the iron stove to steady herself. She looked out the shattered window at the dark, violent mountain. I am not dying in this tower, she said to the empty room. I am not dying because Arthur decided I was worthless. I am 68 years old, and I still matter. She picked up the rusted staple gun. She grabbed the torn edge of the plastic sheeting. She leaned her entire body weight against the howling wind. She drove a staple deep into the rotting wood. She kept working. The morning after the gale broke bright and freezing, Eleanor knelt on the damp floorboards with a frayed straw broom. She swept the melted snow and dead pine needles toward the open trapdoor. Barnaby limped across the small cabin to reach his water bowl. His back right hip gave out slightly on the wet wood. He stumbled sideways and crashed heavily into the wooden drafting box. The heavy oak box tipped over and struck the cast-iron stove leg. A loud, sharp crack echoed in the glass cab. Eleanor dropped her broom and hurried to the dog. She ran her hands over his ribs and legs to check for injuries. Barnaby wagged his tail and licked her wrist. He was unhurt. Eleanor turned her attention to the wooden box. The impact had split the thick bottom panel entirely in half. The wood had sheared along a hidden internal seam. It was a false bottom built into the base of the drafting case. Eleanor reached down to push the splintered wood back into place. Her fingers brushed against something dry and stiff. It was not wood. She pulled the broken panel completely away. A thick manila envelope was wedged tightly into the secret compartment. The heavy brass compass rolled out of the open box. It hit the floorboards and stopped right next to the envelope. The glass face caught the harsh morning sun. Eleanor sat back on her heels. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. Her chest tightened until she had to force herself to inhale. She reached for the manila envelope. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely grip the paper. She pulled the envelope free from the splintered wood. The flap was unsealed. She slid a thick stack of heavy parchment papers onto the floorboards. She stared at the top page in complete confusion. The black type was faded but perfectly legible. It read, Prenuptial Agreement, Vance. The date printed at the top was exactly 40 years ago. She touched the ink with her thumb. Why had Arthur hidden this inside a forgotten box? Why had he forced her to take this box away from the estate? He had told Diane it was just her old desk junk. He had never checked the false bottom. Eleanor picked up the stack of papers. She read the first page again. It was the exact text the attorney had read in the polished conference room. She flipped slowly through the dense legal paragraphs. Her hands were completely still now. She reached the final 2 pages of the document. She stared at the bottom of the paper. She blinked and rubbed her eyes. She read the signature block for a second time. She read it a third time to ensure her eyes were not failing her. Arthur's signature was written in his familiar blue fountain pen ink. Her own signature sat right next to it, but the thick black lines underneath were completely empty. The line marked Witness 1 was blank. The line marked Witness 2 was blank. The square box designated for the official notary seal was completely bare. The paper was flawless white in that spot. The document in her hands was legally meaningless. A prenuptial agreement without independent witnesses and a notary seal was completely void. The document Arthur had used to take the estate was a forgery. He had manufactured a witnessed copy for the lawyers. He had hidden the unfinished original 40 years ago and forgotten where. Then he had handed it directly to her. Eleanor dropped the papers onto the floorboards. The heavy brass compass sat right next to the blank witness lines. The needle pointed directly at the empty notary box. Her lungs felt suddenly very large and very full of air. She picked up the final page and held it up to the morning light. The watermark of the paper mill shone clearly through the parchment. She traced the empty signature lines with her calloused index finger. She looked at the sleeping golden retriever. "He forgot he hid it here, Barnaby," Eleanor whispered to the empty room. "He built his entire empire on a lie, and he handed me the proof." The wind whistled softly through the gap in the plastic sheeting. The small fire in the iron stove cracked and hissed. Eleanor sat on the cold floorboards for a very long time. She looked out the window at the sprawling valley below. She could see the faint grey ribbon of the highway cutting through the trees. That road led directly back to the city. It led back to the glass towers and the mahogany conference rooms. She looked down at the documents resting on the floor. She pulled a blank piece of paper from her canvas bag. She picked up a pencil and wrote down 3 items: the architectural firm, the country estate, the investment portfolios. Without the notary seal, the law divided all marital assets equally. She drew a thick, dark line straight through the center of her list. He had thrown her away to keep everything. He had handed her the very document that would cut his empire in half. She carefully stacked the original parchment pages back into a neat pile. She slid them back into the manila envelope. She placed the heavy brass compass on top of the envelope. She closed her canvas tote bag. It was enough. Eleanor did not drive back to the city to hire a lawyer. She folded the manila envelope and placed it under her thin sleeping bag. She drove the battered sedan down the muddy logging road to the valley. The owner of the general store was staring at a disorganized ledger behind the counter. Eleanor walked in and offered to balance his chaotic books. She spent 3 hours untangling his quarterly taxes and missing invoices. He traded her 4 large panes of tempered glass and a box of heavy roofing nails. She returned the next morning and balanced the local diner's inventory sheets. The diner owner gave her 20 planks of Killine dried cedar and a gallon of weather sealant. She became the unofficial accountant for the small mountain town. She traded 40 years of uncredited financial expertise for raw building materials. Thomas followed her up the mountain in his rusted pickup truck. The truck bed was loaded with salvaged timber from a collapsed valley barn. They worked relentlessly through the brief, cold autumn afternoons. Eleanor used the steel claw of a heavy hammer to rip up the rotting floorboards. Her hands blistered and bled against the jagged wooden splinters. She wrapped her palms in torn cloth and kept pulling the rusted nails. She measured the new cedar planks and cut them with a handsaw. The sharp, clean smell of fresh cedar replaced the heavy odor of dry rot. Thomas helped her lift the heavy tempered glass panes into the empty window frames. She applied thick lines of silicone glazing to seal the bitter wind out completely. She did not stop working when her lower back seized with sharp, burning pain. She stretched new corrugated tin panels over the leaking roof. She hammered the heavy roofing nails flat against the cold metal. The loud, rhythmic banging echoed across the silent pine ridge. She found a discarded cast-iron wood stove sitting behind the town dump. Thomas helped her haul the massive stove up the 70 metal stairs. They used a heavy canvas sling and rested at every single landing. Eleanor scrubbed the thick rust away with steel wool and white vinegar. She polished the black iron until it gleamed in the afternoon light. She gathered smooth grey river stones from the shallow creek bed. She mixed heavy mortar in a plastic bucket using freezing water. She stacked the stones to build a heat shield behind the stove. The thick masonry absorbed the fire's heat and kept the small cabin warm all night. She built a gentle wooden ramp over the steep metal stairs for Barnaby. She secured rough traction tape to the cedar planks. The old golden retriever walked up the sturdy incline without a single whimper. She tore away the splintered exterior catwalk railing with a heavy crowbar. She salvaged thick steel cables from an abandoned logging site down the road. She bolted the heavy cables through the solid wooden corner posts. The tension held the new cedar railing firmly in place. She built a solid desk from the remaining cedar planks. She sanded the wooden edges until they were perfectly smooth under her hands. Her heavy navy wool coat became permanently stained with pine pitch and sawdust. Her posture straightened as her muscles adapted to the constant, heavy lifting. She traded a month of future bookkeeping for a heavy solar battery and 2 panels. She mounted the panels to the southern catwalk railing with heavy steel brackets. She wired them to a single glass reading lamp above her new desk. The absolute darkness of the mountain was finally broken by her own light. She set the heavy wooden drafting box on the new desk. She placed the heavy brass compass exactly in the center of the wood. The physical transformation of the glass cab took exactly 6 weeks. The rotting wooden box became a fortress of solid light. The floorboards were smooth, tight, and golden. The new glass windows framed the sprawling mountain valley in perfect clarity. The tattered blue plastic tarp was completely gone from the roof. It was replaced by solid, weather-tight steel that hummed in the wind. The moment the property became genuinely beautiful happened on a cold Tuesday. Eleanor washed the final pane of glass with a vinegar rag. She stepped back and dropped the rag onto the wooden table. The late afternoon sun hit the clean west window perfectly. The light poured across the new cedar floor and warmed the entire room. The glass cabin glowed like a massive lantern suspended in the autumn sky. It was finally finished. Eleanor opened her canvas tote bag to retrieve a pencil. Her fingers brushed against a thick piece of stiff cardstock. She pulled it out and turned it over in the morning light. It was a folded wedding photograph Arthur had tossed inside the drafting box. She looked at the young woman in the white dress. She looked at the way the young woman leaned entirely against the man beside her. She carried the photograph to the cast-iron stove. She opened the heavy iron door with her bare hand. She dropped the photograph directly onto the glowing red coals. The edges curled instantly in the intense heat. The image of the man in the tuxedo blackened and turned to grey ash. She watched until nothing remained but a thin wisp of smoke. She closed the iron door with a loud, metallic clank. "I am not your foundation anymore, Arthur," she said quietly to the fire. "I am my own roof now." She walked to the new cedar desk and sat down. She rested her forearms on the smooth wood she had sanded herself. A deep stillness settled in the exact center of her chest. The constant, nervous flutter beneath her collarbone stopped completely. Her heartbeat slowed to a heavy, steady rhythm. The tight muscles in her jaw finally unclasped. She realized she was not waiting for an instruction. She realized she was not listening for the sound of tires on gravel. She stood up and walked out onto the catwalk. She leaned her forearms against the cold steel cables. The freezing mountain wind bit sharply at her cheeks. She breathed in the clean scent of wet pine needles and distant snow. The air entered her lungs smoothly and without resistance. She stood perfectly still and watched a hawk circle the vast valley. Hikers began discovering the restored glass cabin in early November. They climbed the rutted logging road with heavy packs and walking sticks. They approached the metal stairs, expecting to find a rotting, condemned ruin. They found a silver-haired woman wearing a heavy navy wool coat. They found her splitting dry firewood with a heavy steel axe. A young woman in a yellow raincoat knocked on the cedar door on a Tuesday. Eleanor opened the door and invited her inside out of the freezing wind. She handed the shivering hiker a tin cup of boiling black tea. The young woman sat on the floorboards near the iron stove. She stared at the flames and talked about a sudden, devastating eviction. She cried quietly into the rising steam of the tea. Eleanor did not offer platitudes or unearned advice. She simply reached out and poured more hot water into the tin cup. Thomas brought his grandson up the mountain on a clear Saturday morning. Eleanor showed the boy the heavy brass compass sitting on the desk. She taught him how to align the needle with the northern ridge. The general store owner drove his truck up the muddy road the following week. He brought a basket of fresh green apples and another tangled ledger book. Eleanor sat with him on the catwalk and explained the math columns. 2 weeks later, a retired schoolteacher arrived at the base of the tower. She carried a small potted rosemary plant wrapped in newspaper. She had heard about the woman living in the sky from the diner owner. Eleanor carried the terracotta pot inside and set it near the warm glass. The teacher sat by the stove and talked about the absolute silence of her empty house. Eleanor listened while she polished the brass compass with a soft cloth. She made quiet space for the woman's grief. Visitors began arriving regularly without invitations. They brought split firewood, jars of preserved peaches, and heavy wool blankets. They carried their own quiet losses up the 70 metal stairs. Barnaby greeted each of them with a slow wag of his tail. He rested his heavy grey muzzle on their knees while they drank tea. The visitors did not treat Eleanor like a discarded wife. They did not look at her with the pity reserved for the abandoned. They looked at her calloused hands and the solid cedar walls she had built. They looked at the massive iron stove she had hauled up the mountain. They recognized her entirely as an equal. She poured their tea and shared the warmth of her fire. She did not need their rescue. She simply shared her light. A black luxury SUV struggled up the muddy logging road on a Thursday afternoon. The engine whined loudly against the steep incline. The expensive tires spun wildly against the wet mountain rocks. Arthur stepped out into the freezing mud in Italian leather shoes. He wore a heavy cashmere overcoat and lined leather gloves. He stared up at the towering structure of the fire lookout. He did not notice the perfectly sanded cedar railing. He did not notice the thick, clear panes of tempered glass. He did not notice the smoke rising steadily from the iron stovepipe. He gripped the freezing metal railing and began to climb. His breath came in short, heavy gasps in the thin mountain air. He stopped twice to rest his aching knees on the landings. Eleanor stood quietly on the catwalk and watched him approach. She wore her heavy navy wool coat stained with pine pitch. Her hands rested lightly on the cold steel tension cables. She held the heavy brass compass casually in her right palm. Barnaby sat beside her, watching the man on the stairs. The dog did not bark. Arthur reached the top landing and leaned heavily against the wooden corner post. His face was flushed red from the cold and the physical exertion. He forced a tight, polished smile that did not reach his eyes. "Eleanor, we have been so worried about you," Arthur said between breaths. "Living up here in this weather is completely irresponsible. Diane has been sick with worry about your health." Eleanor looked at his clean, uncalloused hands gripping the wood. She looked at the mud ruining his expensive leather shoes. She did not step aside to invite him inside the warm cabin. Arthur rubbed his leather gloves together against the biting wind. "I need to ask a small favor to wrap up the final paperwork," he said. "The firm is being audited for the corporate transition this week. I need that old wooden drafting box you took from the office." He looked past her shoulder through the pristine glass window. He stared directly at the splintered wooden box sitting near the iron stove. "It's just some old tax receipts the accountants are demanding. It's a clean break, Eleanor, once I get those files. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Eleanor rubbed her thumb across the scratched glass face of the compass. She saw the desperate, sharp panic hiding behind his polished tone. His corporate lawyers had finally audited his private vault. They had realized the original prenuptial agreement was entirely missing. They knew the copied document he provided would not survive a legal challenge. Without the blank original, he could not prove the witness signatures were valid. "You did not drive 300 miles in the mud for tax receipts, Arthur," Eleanor said calmly. Her voice was completely steady. "You came for the unsigned prenuptial agreement." Arthur dropped the polished smile completely. His face tightened into a hard, cold, furious mask. He took one aggressive step forward on the cedar planks. "You have no idea how to manage that kind of corporate money," he said sharply. 40 years is a long time, but you were essentially just the help. Give me the documents." Eleanor looked at the man she had served for 2,000 weeks. She felt absolutely nothing for him. She did not want revenge. She only wanted her own quiet life. "You forged a notary seal to steal 40 years of my labor," she said quietly. "You handed me this mountain because you thought it was a graveyard. You thought I was too weak to survive without you. You were wrong about both." Arthur scoffed loudly and crossed his arms over his cashmere coat. "Be practical, Eleanor. You cannot fight my legal team with $400. "I don't have to," Eleanor replied. "Thomas is a retired county court clerk. He drove the original document down to the district judge on Tuesday morning. The voided contract is already a matter of public record. The fraud investigation into your firm started yesterday." Arthur stared at her in complete, breathless silence. The mountain wind howled violently across the metal catwalk. His leather-gloved hands dropped slowly to his sides. The massive financial empire he had built on her invisible labor was legally frozen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Eleanor turned around and walked back inside her warm cedar cabin. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The rusted lock clicked into place. 6 months after the black luxury SUV drove back down the mountain, the heavy winter snow had melted into a bright, rushing river in the valley below. The muddy logging road was now lined with thick green spring brush. Eleanor sat on the smooth cedar planks of the eastern catwalk. She wore a light denim work shirt and her weathered leather boots. Her silver hair was tied back with a simple leather cord. Barnaby lay stretched out in a large square of warm morning sunlight. His breathing was deep, slow, and rhythmic against the wood. He did not shiver from the cold anymore. Next to her sat a steaming tin cup of black tea and a plate of sliced apples. She held a thick, leather-bound ledger resting in her lap. She traced the neat columns of numbers with a sharpened wooden pencil. She was calculating the lumber and concrete costs for a new valley community center. The general store owner had asked her to manage the town's entire expansion budget. She no longer worked for free. Half of the Arthur Vance architectural firm's liquid assets now sat in her independent bank account. The corporate fraud investigation had dissolved his stolen empire entirely in under 90 days. The state had seized the firm's major contracts and frozen his personal accounts. Diane had packed her expensive luggage and left the estate before the winter even ended. Eleanor did not read the court documents the lawyers mailed to the town post office. She used the thick legal envelopes to start the morning fire in her iron stove. She simply kept her ledger balanced and her glass cabin warm. She closed the heavy leather book and set it flat on the wooden deck. She reached into her front pocket and pulled out the heavy brass compass. She placed it perfectly in the center of the dark leather cover. The bright spring sun caught the polished metal and the clear glass face. The magnetic needle vibrated slightly before locking steadily on true north. She watched the sunlight reflect off the brass and dance against the new glass windows. She did not need it to navigate the polished mahogany conference rooms anymore. She did not need it to survive the frictionless, empty halls of her former life. The compass rested exactly where it belonged. She looked out over the vast, quiet wilderness she now owned completely. She touched the warm brass one final time. "You gave me the exact direction I needed, Arthur," she said to the open sky. Eleanor Vance spent 4 decades building a life that another person claimed entirely as his own. Arthur Vance believed his strength came from custom Italian suits and corner office views. He believed his power lived in polished mahogany conference tables and luxury vehicles. He believed he could erase his wife with a single forged legal document. He thought handing her the rusted key to a ruined fire tower would break her spirit completely. He did not understand the basic, physical mechanics of genuine survival. A person who knows how to lay a solid working foundation can never truly be left with nothing. She simply gathers her remaining tools and builds an entirely new house. Arthur now sits alone in a small, rented apartment in the Grey City. His massive corporate bank accounts are permanently locked by state financial auditors. His phone screen remains completely dark throughout the long weekends. It does not ring with lucrative invitations to high society galas. Diane packed her expensive designer luggage on the day the first subpoena arrived. She did not leave a forwarding address on the kitchen counter. Arthur stares at the blank white walls of his temporary living room. He drinks cheap coffee from a paper cup. He realizes he never actually knew how to build a single successful thing. He only knew how to sign his name to the bottom of Eleanor's invisible labor. Eleanor sits on her solid cedar deck and listens to the sweeping mountain wind. The heavy brass compass sits on her own hand-built wooden desk. The thick glass windows she installed herself hold back the bitter winter cold perfectly. This is what absolute, final justice actually looks like in the real world. It is not a loud, dramatic speech delivered in a crowded city courtroom. It is not a vindictive phone call to a ruined ex-husband. It is a warm, quiet cabin, standing tall on a high mountain ridge. It is a thick financial ledger with her own name written plainly on the cover. It is the smell of fresh split firewood and boiling black tea. It is an old golden retriever sleeping safely in a bright square of morning sunlight. She survived the devastating, calculated betrayal of the 2 people she trusted most in the world. She did not survive by begging for her old life back. She survived by remembering the immense, undeniable value of her own 2 hands. She took a rotting wooden box in the sky and turned it into a fortress. She took a forged piece of paper and turned it into absolute liberation. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you have ever had your hard work claimed by someone else, if you have ever been told you were too old to start completely over, if you have ever been handed the scraps of your own life and told to be grateful, leave one word in the comments describing the exact moment Eleanor found those blank signature lines. Because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. The people who build the foundation always outlast the people who just live in the house. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their invisible labor has immense, undeniable value. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.